Hey, how you doing? My name's Angela McCall and this is Point and Click Puzzle Games, the YouTube channel that teaches kids and adults how to code mobile app games using Solar 2D game environment and Lua programming language. Now, in today's video, I'm going to touch on things that I've actually covered in quite a lot of detail previously in other videos on this channel, but it has been a wee while since I've done that, and I'm going to try and bring everything all into one as a quick summary, just as a bit of a recap also for my own use in the future. Now, I'm right at the beginning of a new journey building a new app, so I'm going to just quickly sort of introduce you from that process. Over on my left hand side screen here, you can see my file and folders, and you can see the app in existence here. And if you look very neatly, I haven't got any main Lua files, only the main Lua file itself, but I haven't got my main Lua files living in this root directory of the app, because I'm going to have a huge amount of files in this app that I'm building, and I wanted a much more neater, more organized way of looking after and managing all of the different assets and files in existence within this app. So let's quickly talk you through it. In my app folder, I have got the menus, title screens, and my cutscene, which we'll cover in just a moment. I then have an audio folder, a fonts folder, images. They're normal assets that you would bring in, so they aren't actual files, but they are Lua files, that is, but they are assets that I use within my game, and they are therefore referenced in a slightly different way. We've also then got zone A, so just like chapters of a book, I'm going to have lots and lots of different zones that people have to, navigate their adventure through. And for now, just for simplicity, I'm calling them zones A, B, C, D, etc. Okay, so the only Lua file that really is going to exist in this main root hierarchy of my app is the main.lua file. And as you probably should be aware by now, when a device opens an app for the very first time, it has to find a file to sort of initiate that app to exist in memory, and so it looks for a main.lua. Now, if I minimize and get rid of this, you can see here that I have already navigated over to my sort of design environment, as it were. I told you I was in the very early stages, so there's just some splash screens or placeholder images going on here. But you can see that the app's been brought into existence, okay, and then my splash screen's been and gone. And now we're on basically a scene called T2, so a title screen 2. This exists as a Trojan horse, so in the background I will actually load all of the different variables that are going to hold the app status and its current gameplay and whatever items are in the inventory and whatever scene they've actually worked their way through to. And as you can see there, we're halfway through that process. Now, the thing that I actually like to do before we go into anything else further is I give myself little print commands throughout all of my scenes. So I use the scene template that the Solar 2D guys and girls suggest that we use when working with the composer. The composer being like the sort of god, as it were, within my app that manages everything that's going on. And I want to know in memory, in the device memory, something that we can't physically see exactly what is going on at any particular time. So I program in a way whereby once a scene has been on screen, I don't recycle, I physically close it down. Now, there are arguments for and against, but I think for me in the type of game and the app that I'm building, it's a much more neater, tidier way to ensure that all of the variables associated with that particular scene get eaten up and disappeared from the memory of the device and that kind of thing. So for me, it's my preferred way of working in the type of apps I like to build. Now, I'm going to give you a quick demonstration. So we're on T2 splash app logo. I click on continue. We go through to my M1 screen, which is my main or my first menu screen, and you can see here that the splash screen that we were on has now nicely tidied itself away from the device memory, and we are now halfway through the process of using the menu scene that we're on right now. Okay, and if I go to settings, you can see that that blue highlighted section's just moved up, and the rest of that menu has now been sort of hidden, destroyed, and the scene closed down and removed from memory. And now as we're on settings, you can see here that we are now using the settings scene in the device memory. how that correlates over on the left hand side to the rest of my files. So in exactly the same way we just saw in File and Folder Explorer, we've got the files, and here is my app folder that contain all of those menu scenes that we're using so far. Now, the reason I'm creating this video is kind of like as a memory jogger to myself, that when we now start to move files out of the main root path and we start nesting them inside folders, we have to update the syntax that we use to address that Lua file in our code by using the folder name followed by a full stop, the full stop, not a /. We use / when we're using audio files, we're using font references, we're using images. These are all assets, so they can use the /. But when we are referencing a folder or when we are referencing a .lua file inside a folder, we have to use a full stop to separate the path. Now, if you don't do that, you can cause yourself some problems in memory whereby multiple instances of the same scene will start to exist. So for example, if we was to open up the settings scene, fiddle around, disappear back to the main menu and then go back to settings, that could be a second instance in memory now existing, and that's when you start to have a bug that eats up memory and causes the device to crash, but you can't figure out why, because from the human user eye and the experience that we are physically seeing, there's nothing wrong, but in the background we're not doing our admin and tidying things up nicely. So quickly to have a look at how and what's going on here. First of all, up in my cutscene at the moment, I've got all of these commented out, so I'm going to invoke them just so that you can see quickly in the console what that actually looks like when we reload the app in just a second. So I'm sliding on down. As you can see, it's the same coding or print command lines that I give in all of my Lua files, and they stay there in existence all the way up until I publish the app. That's only when then, and it does take a wee while, a good cup of tea, and I sort of sit there, open file, remove all the prints, and it can be a bit annoying, but the time it saves me and the frustration it saves me is worth its weight in gold for doing it and working that way. So I've now removed the comments from being hidden. I'm going to save this, everything's going to reload. So that's my splash screen 1, that's my splash screen 2, clicking on continue. And you can see down here, things are slightly different than before. And if you look really closely, what's actually happening is as one scene is loading, the other one is coming into play. And actually two scenes are being managed simultaneously in the composer environment. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So if we look, we're on here, the main menu screen. So here we can see here that the menu was loaded, created, the template, the scene template showed wheel, and then eventually by the time it's finished doing its thing, it was fully loaded on screen, which is great. But whilst that scene was loading, in the background, my cutscene was also being destroyed. Now, if you go further back up here when we was on the splash screen, so where we are, splash screen show, that's the status we would have been at before we hit the continue button. As the splash screen started to close down, the cutscene was being called into existence. And then obviously the splash screen finished being removed from the device memory, allowing the cutscene to open and close. And that's just allowing the reason the only reason the cutscene exists is for that 1 second delay, which is in this line here. That 1 second delay simply gives the app and the composer time to neatly pack away the splash scene before it fully starts working with the main menu. There is no other code, there's no objects being loaded, there's no nothing. And that cutscene process in this particular app, you didn't get to see it because it's on screen for like a millisecond, and because there's no objects to physically or display objects, there's nothing visually to see. The process for the user is nice and smooth. Some apps actually embrace that kind of cutscene and throw little funky graphics on the scene and on the screen and this kind of thing as part of the user experience. That's nothing wrong with that approach. I just didn't want or don't want that approach in my app because it will be, because of the nature of my app, it's not applicable to me. Okay, so if I come back over to my cutscene and undo all of those changes so that my comments re-exist, and save and close. We can then just quickly go through to the main menu here and just look at the paths being used. Now, I use my own libraries, so the first thing that we do at the top here is, because everything lives in a folder now and not in the main root directory, is I have to bring in my modules using the path and that full stop that I told you about. So here's my library folder on the left hand side with my module called admin, and because I've now referenced it into a local variable which lives just inside this main menu.lua file called modAdmin, later on down here, as you can see in use, I only need to reference modAdmin, and that's basically saying go to the function cutscene in my admin. So let's quickly look at that. So down here, it brings in the file name that I've just sent it. It also stores that name in a global variable for the entire app, which gets overwritten every time the cutscene is called. So my app always knows at any particular time where we are, which is when later on, when, say, for example, the user has navigated to scene 66, I will be able to reload the game in at 66 instead of making them start from scene 1 again. But that's a story for another day. And then, as you can see there, go to scene, and it's going now to the app cutscene, and it crossfades, and so on and so on and so on. It goes through the process. Okay, and then finally, don't forget, the other thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we're removing the scene properly using the app or the folder name and the full stop, because if we was not to include that and we just put M1 main menu, what would happen is the composer would be looking for a file that lived in the root path directory of the app, and that doesn't exist, and therefore it wouldn't be removing anything because there was nothing to be removed. It wouldn't necessarily cause an error, but what would happen is that main menu, when we've navigated away, would still exist in memory, and when we navigate back, a second version of it would be created, and then when we navigate away and come back again, a third version. So then the device would be holding 3 versions of the main menu, and although the human user of the app would physically only see that one same screen and know no different, eventually the device will crash because it's hundreds of instances of that scene would exist in memory. So ensure always that you make sure the path is being used. And again, in order to not accidentally forget that, because sometimes when you're coding, especially if it's late at night or you've had a busy day, you know, we're human, we make mistakes. If I was to ever forget that, as I practice and I'm loading in my app, this composer is reporting to me, and I would spot it because eventually multiple instances would appear, and it would say things like, so for example, down here it would say, T2 Splash App logo show did loaded, but I'd have 4 or 5 identical lines, meaning there'd be 4 or 5 instances of that scene in device memory. And that would make me think, hang on a second, somewhere something's not closing down and being destroyed. And that's how I can sort of stop memory bleed happening in my app as I program. So I hope you found this useful. It's probably a little bit complicated to follow, which is why I've also made a video for my own reference, because it will trigger. And the easiest thing I can suggest you do is create yourself 3 or 4 Lua files, start navigating through them like I've just done there with buttons going back and forth, so you can see the files physically being called into memory and being destroyed, and play around with the path names. You'll get some errors and you'll understand a bit more about the path names, but also it will mean that instances will start to exist, and you'll be thinking, oh, memory bleed here in your device and your app. And 9 times out of 10, if there is ever a problem, it's going to be to do with the fact that you're not tidying up the admin of your scenes when you are closing and navigating away from them. And this is a very handy programming technique to adopt and learn if you're quite a novice, and even if you're not a novice. Like I said, everybody makes mistakes, and I constantly live by this process, so I know exactly. I'm a control freak. I love to know exactly what's going on, why it's going on, and yeah, hopefully the two things tally up nicely. So if you did like this video, please be really sweet, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you on another video real soon. Take care. Bye bye.